And I am looking forward now to welcoming our next presenter and a new session really, which is on tackling climate change. What is the role for NATO? And so today we're going to be hearing from Michael Ruehle, head of the Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security section at NATO. We'll have time for a short Q&A session at the end of this talk. So if you have any questions, same procedure that we've been following through this entire session, which is to please type your questions into the chat with your name and your organization, and we will do our best to get to them after Michael presents. So with that, please welcome Michael Ruehle.
Thank you very much for having me on this program. More and more people see climate change as the greatest threat to mankind, and I think it's easy to see why. Rising global temperatures, rising sea levels, extreme weather events, both you and Joan van der Waart put it very succinctly, it's a threat multiplier. And NATO is a security institution, so there's a natural link between the two. NATO is not the primary addressee when it comes to climate change. This role is played by other international actors, I would say, in particular those who can set limits on CO2 emissions, for example. But as a transatlantic security and defense organization, NATO is a key forum for discussing the security implications of climate change. And in fact, the alliance has been addressing the effects of climate change for many years. For example, since the 1970s, we've been setting environmental protection standards for certain military activities. Similarly, we've been funding climate-related research for decades. And we've made considerable progress, particularly over the last decade, in reducing the consumption of fossil fuel in military camps through integrating renewables like wind or solar. We've also acquired considerable experience in responding to humanitarian disasters. For example, in an earthquake in Pakistan, a major earthquake in 2005, NATO delivered 3,500 tons of supplies to the crisis region. And in other natural disasters, such as floods in allied countries or partner countries, but also in the early phase of the COVID pandemic, NATO coordinated national contributions so that they were used to their best effect. So all this makes clear that a higher public profile of NATO on climate security is not only conceivable, it is actually desirable. And this fits into the logic of other initiatives. For example, the EU, the European Union's Green Deal, which aims to make the Union carbon neutral by 2050. Now, let's be cautious, let's not exaggerate. As we make the transition to a future powered by more sustainable forms of energy, armed forces will continue to consume for a considerable amount of time, considerable amounts of fossil fuel. And that's why a new NATO approach to climate change must not downplay NATO's most important contribution to security, namely the prevention of military conflict through collective military power. Military security and environmental security are both of existential importance. They must not be played off against each other. They're both two sides of the same coin. And but that said, NATO can and should demonstrate that it takes environmental concerns into account, and that our armed forces are more than just an innocent bystander to the climate debate. What does all of this mean in concrete terms? What is NATO's role when it comes to meeting the challenge of climate change? Basically, there are three major areas: awareness, adaptation, and mitigation. A few words on awareness. As I already said, NATO is the key transatlantic platform for allies when it comes to security, and this means also for identifying, monitoring, discussing the security implications of climate change. And that's why we'll soon start conducting regular NATO-wide climate change and security impact assessments. These assessments will analyze the impact of climate change on NATO's strategic assets, installations, missions, operations. We will also include climate aspects into our security risk assessments. We need to conduct more systematic foresight efforts on climate change. We must leverage our own research, science, and technology programs to support research on the impact of climate change on allied security. We try to increase our awareness on region-specific climate vulnerabilities, and we should also analyze what climate change means for other major actors, say Russia or China. Simply put, we must understand climate change as a phenomenon that will shape every single aspect of our strategic environment. The second point, adaptation. Put simply, climate change makes it harder for our militaries to perform, whether engaged in combat training or disaster relief. In Afghanistan, allies had to replace some of their helicopter engines because they simply couldn't cope with the heat and the dust. In the maritime domain, we have seen that climate-induced change in the salinity of water affects the engines of our warships. So climate change has already started to change how we operate, but climate will also affect where we operate. For example, climate change will cause further natural disasters, which may require the military to provide humanitarian relief. In addition, much of our critical infrastructure is exposed. This was already mentioned by the previous speaker. Many naval bases, for example, suffer from regular and extensive flooding. So to remain effective, we must adapt, and this means incorporating climate change into the defense planning process, our procurement practices, and our exercises. And at the same time, we also need to enhance our national resilience against climate-induced hazards, such as extreme weather events. We also must reflect climate change in our partnerships. As climate change affects many of our partner countries, they will certainly be interested in working with NATO on scientific cooperation, for example, or on mitigation measures, but also on consequence management, training, and education. Third and finally, mitigation. Climate change happens largely because we burn fossil fuel. That's why we all have a responsibility to cut emissions. And the military will not be an exception. Fortunately, there are technologies that allow us to do this without losing military effectiveness. In other words, there are many technologies out there that could deliver what I would call win-win outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, NATO has been running projects to reduce the use of fossil fuel in military camps by bringing in wind and solar. Many allies have been conducting experiments with biofuel, with special paint to reduce the water drag on the hull of warships, with LEDs to reduce electricity consumption in military installations. Others are experimenting with hydrogen fuel cells, batteries to generate, store electricity. All this is done, and let me emphasize that, all this is done for practical military reasons, because the more energy efficient we become, the less we need to rely on vulnerable fuel supply chains, and the better our mission endurance. Of course, if we want to reduce emissions in a systematic way, then we first need to know how much fuel we actually consume. In other words, we need to undertake a major mapping exercise that would establish some baseline numbers. And this is going to be quite challenging, but if the allies commit to it, and we're in the process of negotiating this, we can do that. Whether this could lead our forces to reach carbon net zero by 2050, as some actually believe, well, it remains to be seen. But what counts most at this stage is that we start preparing for such a future. Last March, NATO foreign ministers agreed a so-called NATO agenda for climate change and security, which contains many of the ideas that I just shared with you. We are now working on a more detailed action plan to be agreed in time for our NATO summit next month. So all this demonstrates that when it comes to global challenges such as climate change, NATO will not just be an innocent bystander, but an alliance that is willing and ready to take concrete action. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. And we do actually have many questions that have come through for you. The audience is very curious, and you put so much great information forward. So let's try and get two in, at least before we have to end this session. Thank you for your time and for the work you do. NATO, of course, is of critical importance as we go forward and confront this new adversary, if we're terming it as such, which is climate change. But NATO and national militaries are talking about mitigating the effects of climate change, yet have been exempt from the Paris Accords. So is that not in contradiction if we're going to really say that NATO and other military alliances need to play a really active role in ensuring that we reach these targets by mid-century and at the end of the century of less than 2 degrees warming?
That's a very good question. Indeed, the military has been exempt, but that's because the military fulfills a certain role. I mean, this is not simply a car for your private, a tank is not a car that you use for your private entertainment. A tank for example, has a role to play. It has to function in very demanding circumstances. So you can't measure the military with exactly the same yardstick that you would measure civilian goods. So that's why there are exemptions. But as I said, this is changing in the sense that more and more we come to the conclusion that the military cannot be completely outside this climate discussion. The military must show that it also takes climate change seriously, and not just as a threat multiplier, but also its own responsibility in mitigation, in contributing to mitigation. So the military may not evolve quite as fast as, let's say, the electrification of civilian traffic, because we have to be able to prevail in combat. So that's a different yardstick. But we're going in the same direction. And I think this is the major change that is happening. And previous speakers already alluded to that in the American context in particular. We are going down that road, but we have to be very careful. We also have to have an eye on the missions we have to perform. And these missions, success in mission, in a certain mission or operation, requires highly effective military force. And therefore, you need to balance this requirement with the need to make a contribution to mitigation. So it's always will be a balancing act. It will be a judgment call sometimes. Which technology do you use? But I think we've now reached that point where we're thinking this through very thoroughly.
You raised a really great point there, that there is that balance that we need to strike between moving forward in terms of greening various militaries, but also being able to have that preparedness in place for if and when conflict emerges. And is this going to be more difficult to reconcile than we're really accounting for? How is it that these clean technologies are going to be incorporated into the military, and they're still at this moment less efficient than the higher costs of fossil fuels, not just for the planet, but more broadly in terms of vulnerability for the military? So won't greening militaries reduce efficiency though, if we start that transition against potential adversaries? How do we begin? How do we think about that balance?
Well, one of the things that we've been trying to do for years is to take some of the skepticism of some parts of the military away, that green stuff is just for tree huggers. To give you a simple example, many years ago, I was at a exhibition in Lithuania, and they showed solar panels, which you can scratch, you can crash them on the floor, whatever. You can shoot at them; they will not break. They will still perform as solar panels. So they are rugged for military application. And I think you will see more and more of that happening. That green technology will become rugged for military use, and that over time, I think, will take the fears away that if you go for energy efficient equipment, you somehow diminish your combat power. I think it also, of course, depends which technologies you choose for which kind of missions. Certainly, wind and solar works nicely if you want to reduce the fuel consumption, the diesel consumption in a camp. Wind and solar will not work for the foreseeable future in powering a tank. So you need to be very cautious which technology you use for which applications. But let's not forget, NATO we have 30 countries. All of them are experimenting in one way or the other with energy efficient technologies. If we do a serious best practices exchange, I think we will do that, you will get an enormous amount of information out there, which technologies work better in which situations. And if allies share these experiences, I think we can make a quantum leap in introducing energy efficient technologies, yet without losing any of our combat power.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate the work that you do, the critical importance of alliances going forward to combat our common adversary, in this case, the planet warming. So much appreciated to you and for NATO and for the innovation that is really being underway and being led by alliances like NATO and like IMCCS. So thank you for your words, Michael Ruehle. It was a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you very much.
Our time is up. I would like to thank Michael as well as the previous panelists for joining us today. And we have a full day of content. We are just a few panels in. There's much more to come. So please click on the link that you should see displayed at the top of your screen to get to the next session and continue to stay engaged with us and to share this content widely to your networks through the hashtag ClimateSAN. Thank you all, and see you later today.